No, I mean, architecture is political. We gotta add that stuff.
Indeed.
We're tearing down communities to build multifamily, and you have to understand we are creating displacement. You're displacing Black and brown folks, and they don't come back.
Half of this podcast would be dedicated to the history of Powerhouse, my journey and my discoveries, and hey, I'm going to solve this housing problem.
Hey guys, what's up? My name is Melissa Daniels. This is the Architecture is Political podcast where Black and brown folks talk about architecture. I hope you enjoyed this podcast and be part of my storytelling. I am coming off of AIA conference high. I don't know if many of you know this, but I was a recipient of the AIA William Young Award along with 3 other of my cohorts. We were given a medal. The lovely Kathy Prigmore gave a powerful speech. And also I teamed up with Nikita Reed of Tangible Remnants, and we did a podcast interview at the conference. So it was cool. It was exciting. You're going to hear from that very soon. I had the pleasure of interviewing Karina, Ruiz. Although it was a short conversation of about 30 plus minutes or so, we talked about culture shock. She moved from California to Portland, Oregon. There was a couple of shared experience and really what I don't want to say catapult, but the catalyst, that conversation of the Black and brown community after not only the pandemic, but with George Floyd and everything, and how that was really much a catalyst for the Latinas in Architecture book, which she is a contributing author to. A couple of things that she said, and I love this quote from her, a destination rather than a distribution. You get the reference to that when you listen to this episode. Another thing I learned in talking to her is she's a founding member of BRIC, BRIC, which stands for Building Relationships, Inspiring Communities, and just how prosperous her company and the other principles involved is. And I want to have a separate conversation with her about that, just the business of architecture. I think it's fascinating when you're tapped into a community and you're doing what you love and how it fulfills you in so many ways, not only financially, but also spiritually as well. At least that's the sense I got from talking to her. So I'm going to stop talking and let you guys listen to this conversation. So here you go. Karina, how you doing?
I'm doing great. Melissa, how are you?
I'm great. So tell me a little bit about yourself. You're out in Oregon, Portland? Is that
I am. Our office is in Portland, Oregon. I live in the suburbs, kind of in the Portland metro area. But yeah, I've been living here in Oregon for almost 20 years now. I was born and raised in California, the Bay Area of California, where my parents immigrated to separately from Guatemala. So first generation, right? They came through kind of different paths. My dad came after he had kind of finished high school, came here, learned English, went to Cal, got hired by IBM at his college graduation and worked for them his entire adult life. And my mom's story is very different. She was raised on a coffee plantation in a very rural part of Guatemala, and came here with, probably elementary school education, even though she came at 14, and really proceeded through kind of the school of hard knocks, right? Was working service jobs, worked as an au pair, and then got her GED and got into the business world through that. So those are sort of that's my upbringing, at least.
Have you been back to Guatemala?
I have. We went back probably every 3 or 4 years as kids growing up. And then the last time I was there was it's been a while. It was in 2009. But yeah, toured the country quite a bit. So both of well, my mom is from the northern part of Guatemala. It's called Cuban, Alta Verapaz. And my dad was born near the capital, near Guatemala City. So we've been, obviously, a lot of our family still lives in Guatemala City. And then when you go to Guatemala, you go to the beaches. There's an East Coast and an East Coast and a West Coast of different beach experience. One is a white sand beach. The other's a more lava, black sand beach. We've also spent time in Tikal, which is in kind of the rainforest and where all the Mayan ruins are. So it was my architectural pilgrimage to see the work of the Maya there. So yeah, kind of been to a lot of the country. Still so much to see though. It's a beautiful country.
So you decided that you want to be an astronomer, and then some way, somehow you found architecture. You want to talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, I was just always fascinated by the stars, right? And I remember growing up in the Bay Area. Every kid went to what was then the Academy of Sciences, much less fancy than the new one that they built there about, I don't know, 20 years ago, I guess. But I remember going into the planetarium, and the woman that was leading the session for our elementary school class was Latina. Reminded me of one of my aunts, and I was like, oh. Like, hey, if you can do it, I can do that. And I was just jazzed by it, right? I just loved everything. Still to this day, absolutely love space. And then went to high school with a plan to pursue astronomy as a career. And my high school counselor at the time was, when I went in for my career counseling, was like, hey, there aren't a lot of jobs in astronomy, which is true. It's not a high demand field, but especially for women, and especially for women of color, right? And so I didn't really think anything of it at the time, but then I was like, oh man, maybe I'm not going to do that, right? And so then what am I going to do? And so my sophomore year in high school, I was out sick for, I don't know, 3 days or something. And when I came back in my humanities class, we had to do a project. And the two fields that were left that nobody had chosen at that time were psychology and architecture. And I had no interest in psychology, like negative interest in psychology. And so I chose architecture, and of course did the requisite book report on Frank Lloyd Wright, right? It's the only architect that anybody knew, and like that my high school teacher even knew of. And it was love at first sight. Like legitimately, all the pieces fell into place. And I actually realized at that time that I just didn't know about architecture. So all the things that I was doing, the things that I enjoyed, the way that I saw the world, were through the lens of an aspiring architect. I just didn't know it. And so, to this day, astronomy is still a great hobby of mine, but I'm doing the work I was born to do for sure.
How was architecture school?
It was good. I went to Cal. It was white, to be frank. It was white and pretty male. I went in the 90s, the early 90s. Cal is it's not known for being a technical school, right? It's known for really trying to push you to think differently as a university and as an architecture program, environmental design program. And so I think there was a lot of exposure about how to think about the world, right? And I had an interest also in city planning. So really thinking about both the macro and the micro level of architecture. I worked for a firm that did educational architecture while I was in school. And so it was very interesting because in that field at school, I didn't have anybody that shared my lived experiences ever as a teacher or a boss, right? Like in terms of Latino. I had a graduate student assistant had to have been my sophomore year in college, a Peruvian woman, Patricia, who's still a good friend of mine, who was the first time I ever saw anyone of any Latino descent kind of in a position where she was imparting knowledge on me, right? And the big things that she did in my career was introduce me to non-white male European-centered architecture, right? So whether it was Alvaro Siza or Luis Barragan, but really trying to say, hey, there's more than just what you're hearing every day in architecture school
How did that feel?
About architecture. Yeah. It felt, it's hard to say. There's a part of it that felt like, I don't want to say naughty, but like kind of going rogue. But then also I think what the hell? Like there's so much architecture around the world, African architecture, Asian architecture. Why is it that we say who determines what good architecture is? I mean, there's this whole mid-century modern Scandinavian architecture that is kind of revered as good architecture, capital G, good design. And I just remember even early on going, who is the arbiter of that? As much as I love the work of Alvar Aalto, like anybody else, and I really I did a Mecca to Finland to go and see his work because there was aspects of it that I really loved, but it didn't feel like home to me. Whereas other architecture I felt more comfortable. So that was probably the biggest thing that I noticed.
We share being a first generation American, and I always felt I'm living like a triple life, because you're at home, so you're at your culture, and you step out of it and it's a whole different persona. So when you look at architecture, it's kind of like, yeah, I see it, it can relate, but then you look at, you go home and you're like, yeah, I kind of see it too. You just want something to
bridge.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes. But that doesn't really exist.
Not yet. I'm hopeful that it will more and more as programs start to really bring more diversity, more lived experience, because that's really what it's about. We have this conversation all the time as we talk about the work that we're doing in communities to build the pipeline of architects, in that oftentimes we as architects can be arrogant and say, all it takes is exposure. If I just show somebody what it's like to be an architect, it's going to turn on a light and all of a sudden flock to this profession. For communities where design has been used as a tool for disenfranchisement, for gentrification, moving them out of their houses, all of that, design is a tool for bad. It isn't a tool for good. And so it isn't necessarily to expose people to it. You then have sort of the added hurdle of, now I have to convince people of the power of design to act as a catalyst for positive change, which is a different argument to have. That's when my career in architecture shifted, is when I came to that understanding of like, no, the power of design to impact communities in a positive way is profound. And that's what I want to do. Point me in that direction.
I feel like it's kind of messy because it hasn't been truly developed. There's no Bajas for this, there's no school for the Latinx American architecture or
Right.
African American architecture. There's no school of that, right? The opportunity to explore art is the way that we've been able to express our culture multiple times, but we haven't been able to translate that truly to a building, other than painting a mural, right? To represent the Black and Brown community. That's all that we've been able to do. How do you physically express
manifest it?
Exactly. Sure. Without being messy, without
or
and I say messy. I shouldn't say messy, but you know what I mean.
Without being like almost disrespectful, right? Where you're playing into a trope, right?
Yes. Yes.
I mean, not every building can look like a Mayan pyramid, right? And be like, oh, look, I'm doing Latin American architecture.
Right. Look at my Mayan inspired.
Yeah, exactly. Right. And I mean, there are pieces of that, right, that certainly we can draw from, but you're 100% right that I don't think, and I think that is especially for not designers that are not of color, that don't have that lived experience, who desperately want to design culturally relevant and architecture that isn't harmful. I think they struggle because they want us to just say, they want someone to just say, this is what it should look like. Just give me that. If it has this mural, or if it is this painted this color, or if it has this frieze, like, okay, you're checking a box, because there's such an urgency to correct the harm that's been done. That's a piece we've also had to really push back against. Like you said, there isn't a school of what does it look like to design for diversity, design for inclusion, design for justice. Pieces of it that you can carry and examples of it that you can say, okay, this piece of this does it well, whether it's an all gender, all user restroom, or whether it is, I mean, I remember walking for the first time in the Smithsonian's Museum of African American History and Culture. And for the first time feeling like, oh my God, like it's translated in the architecture, in the materiality, I mean, it's also a museum that's dedicated to it, right? So a lot of it is curated in there, but there were elements of the architecture that for the first time felt grand, but not white. and not supremacist in that way. And so seeing pieces of that, I think you can come to it. But yeah, there's no rule book like there is for proportions and dimensions and all of this stuff that we have around Scandinavian architecture or white architecture, for lack of a better term.
How did you get to Portland, Oregon? How did that happen?
How did that happen? So I came a family, right? So my sister and her boyfriend at the time and husband now moved up here, and all of our extended families, just she and I and what we call our sister cousin, our immediate family, but just the Guatemalan version of my big fat Greek wedding of a family of sort of relatives in the Bay Area, all super close. We still, even though I don't live there anymore, but get together regularly. My dad was one of 6 and my mom is one of 10, and my mom and my dad's family kind of got along, so it was just always a lot of family. And so we always kept saying that my sister and her husband would move back. She went to grad school here, they'll move back, all of these life events. And then she got pregnant and I was like, oh, they might not be moving back, right? And for me, like, I was raised obviously by my mom and dad, but also by this village of my aunts, the tias, right? We call them now the antiques, but this village of women who were like second moms to me. And so I wanted that same experience for our generation, for my sister's kids. And so I moved up here for that. I moved up here to be closer to my nephews. I didn't know what she was having at the time, and then found a job that aligned with what I wanted to do.
Was that difficult to find?
It took a while, and this was in 2003. It wasn't necessarily like the worst time to be looking for a job, but I also was pretty picky about what I wanted. I've practiced primarily educational architecture, public K-12 architecture my entire career. Done some other things, but that's the stuff that gets me up in the morning. And so I knew very much that I wanted a firm that was dedicated to that. I knew that I wanted a firm that was kind of a big family, right? That felt like they're connected, that wasn't just churning out work. And so it took a while to find it. It took me about a year to find the right fit. And then I moved up here. And while everyone in the firm was super open, and like, I have never felt more brown than after I moved to Portland. Like, growing up in California, like, I took for granted diversity, right? I heard so many different languages, like just even on my neighborhood block, there were probably 4 different languages spoken, the smell of all different kinds of foods, like all the things that you just associate with an area where there is more diversity. But because I grew up with it, I didn't really understand the power of it, because it's just, you accept it. It just is what it is, until I moved here. And it took about, I don't know, I always say it took about like 2 weeks of living here to go, oh, that's what's different, right? And so, yeah, I went from a community of, there weren't a lot of us in the architecture firm that I worked in, but there were significantly more than there were here. Yeah, that was hard to really realize how different I was, how different people looked at me, not just because I was a woman, but because, I was Latina. And then just how few of us there were. There is very little community for Black and Brown architects in Portland until recently. Like, I think we started a NOMA chapter here in Portland. It's been now 2 years, and it feels like in the wake of sort of this pandemic and the racial awakening in the country, that we're finally having conversations about that and building community of Black and Brown architects. But still, there are, I think, 4 licensed Black architects in the entire state of Oregon. I think Latino, I could probably count them on probably one hand and one foot, like hands and feet. I don't think
them all too.
Yeah, right. Because they're my sisters, right? Like, that's the other thing that was hilarious, right? Like so I work with 2 other female Latina architects, and it's hilarious because in California, people would look at us and be like, what the heck? Are you guys friends? Blah, blah, blah. But anytime we're together here, it's like, oh, look, are you sisters going out? I'm like, really? We don't even look alike, man.
So what was the pinpoint moment? I know for me, it was the conversations that made me feel like an outsider. The news, for example, that I would listen to, like, oh, did you hear this artist passed away, and it'll be a Black male artist, for example, and they're like, who? What? And it's like huge. I remember when Michael Jackson died.
Mm-hmm.
And that was just a big thing. Or even when R. Kelly went to prison, that was a thing,
when Prince died, right?
Right. Or when Prince, well, it's kind of
Selena, right? But yeah,
right, exactly. Sure. Like these major things that happen. So that was my moment of realization. What was yours?
That's a good question. I mean, I really think it was when I really started to connect educational inequity with racism. Talk about the conversations, noticing the differences between the conversations I was having with white students and teachers and the conversations I was having with Black, Brown, LGBTQ, just basically folks who have been intentionally and historically othered and impacted by inequity, right? And then going, oh, okay, so this is because you're brown, right? And it just impacts you in a different way. So I think for me, it really came to a head. I most noticed here was the lack of integration. Like if you wanted any sort of Latino food, you had to go. You had to go to Woodburn, you had to go to Hillsborough, you had to go, like it wasn't just like at your fingertips. If you wanted to hear Latin music other than in your household, you had to go looking for it. And very much, I mean, even the same thing in our Black neighborhoods, right? It's very much like a destination rather than a distribution intentionally, right?
Yeah.
That I think was also like when I was like, what the hell do you mean I can't go find a tamale or a pupusa on the next corner? Like I gotta go like drive 45 minutes. Where am I? What have you done with it, right? I think it was kind of the combination of those two things for me that made me go, oh, this is different here.
It also curbed my intentions of where I wanted to live. So I live in Maryland now. I live in Columbia. Prior to that, I lived in this extremely diverse. It's African, Caribbean, and South American. So it's extremely diverse. And when I was looking to buy, I bought a condo there. I intentionally bought in that neighborhood because I didn't want to be an outcast in another neighborhood. I didn't want people to question me. I wanted to feel comfortable. I wanted that grocery store up the street. I didn't want to have to drive for that distance. And now I live in the suburbs. So I still got to go back to the condo to get my food. Being in this profession, I knew that my property value would not go anywhere, and it hasn't. And if I'd bought where I knew I could have made, $1 million because, it's DC or, close to the proximity of DC. I didn't do that. And I'm kind of kicking myself for it. Was that part too? Like when you first?
No, I mean, in terms of so I didn't realize the whole like segregation part of Oregon when I first moved here. It took, I don't know, not too long, about 6 months. And I actually moved into the house that I bought is the house that my parents had built when they were coming here when my sister first had the baby, because their plan was to retire 6 months here and 6 months in Guatemala. That plan went out the window as soon as the babies were born, but that was the plan. And so when they realized they wanted to move here, they built a bigger house. And my sister and her husband had lived in Tigard, so kind of a neighboring community. And so I just knew I wanted to be close to them. And for the same reasons, right? Like the idea of the neighborhoods that were more diverse were less desirable because they didn't have access. They didn't have, like, they were in food deserts. They were like all of the things that we can click through as to why people remain in poverty, why they don't have access to resources are the very reasons why living in white suburbia.
Yep. I want to get into what you do for a living and then talk about Latinas in architecture.
Yeah, so one of the founding partners of BRIC Architecture here in Portland, that's BRIC, and it stands for Building Relationships, Inspiring Communities. Like it was really intentional to create a place that was about we always talk about design that empowers learners to change the world. That's really kind of the core of who we are as people, the core of what our firm is designed around. I'd like to think that I inhabit the intersection between design, teaching and learning, and equity. Like that's my jam. That's my sweet spot. And so as a firm, we facilitate, we plan, and we design public K-12 schools with a very intentional sort of design justice and racial equity informed approach.
Was it a difficult decision to be a firm owner?
Yes and no. Yes, because it's not typically something you choose to do at 45, right? So there's risk. We didn't have, when we launched the firm, it was the three of us. The parts that were easy was that I was starting the firm with my best friend and a good friend that I've known for 20 years, right? Who'd worked together. We had all worked together. And so that part was easy. We went from a firm of the three of us sitting in a space that we had leased that was empty. We had I remember meeting, our first meeting was like around these poker tables and like camping chairs with a significant loan, all of the liens on your house that comes with that, right? No work, no employees. And within 30 days, we had 33 employees and probably $500 million worth of construction contracts.
What?
Yeah.
What the hell?
It was crazy.
How did you do
It was
that?
insane. It's the relationships part, right? Like a lot of the folks from the firm that we had worked together at previously came because they believed in what we were creating. And a lot of our clients that we had worked with previously said, hey, we want to come work with you. And so it was really just this, I want to say a happy accident, but I think it's about the relationships. I mean, now we're almost 50. We're going into our 5th year. I'm about to celebrate our 5th anniversary. And so, we always talk about how we were the startup that never really started up. Like we're, learning to build and design and fly a jet all at the same time. But I wouldn't change it for anything because I think I've never worked at a place that was more mission driven. People came because of the mission. They came because of the relationships. They came because of the work that we're doing, and they stay because of that. And so that means that our work is different. People truly believe in the power of education and then the power of design to impact education in a positive way.
I wish I should have started the conversation with that. Like
it was bananas. It was like it's unbelievable to me still. Like I always called it like the little engine that could, and yeah, still doing it.
I know, knock on wood. Oh my goodness.
It's a crazy story.
That's beautiful. Do you understand? Like that is so beautiful. I'm speechless.
Yeah, I'll cry. Like I cry when I think, like it gives me goosebumps every time I think about it. For sure.
It's amazing. This is why you are an example of why people should stay in architecture. You got out of the rat race that you didn't have any control over.
Yeah.
And you started your own rat race that you control.
Don't see, it's funny. I have this conversation all the time, in mentorship type conversations. I always tell people, like, if you don't see what you want, but you have a clear vision of what it is you want, go create it. Just go do it. And, again, I have privilege in saying that, right? That, for a lot of reasons, but yeah, I got blessed to be able to do this with my best friends and with people who I had just like infinite trust in. And then the power of the relationships to carry us forward it's a very beautiful thing to have witnessed and been a part of, for sure.
How did you get into the Latinas in Architecture book?
Yeah. So again, through kind of post the murder of George Floyd and kind of the, Black Lives Matter kind of reawakening of race in America, we definitely as an industry started having more accountability conversations. And so then it became like, okay, how are we diversifying the profession? How are we diversifying the pipeline? What does that all look like? And so I was involved in a conversation with, I think it was AIA San Francisco, around Yeah, it was around what does it mean to be a Latina in architecture. And there was a woman named Alicia Ponce from Chicago who was also in that conversation. And she had partnered with a book publisher called Fig Factor Media, also Latina woman run. And they were interested in bringing together an anthology of stories of women in architecture. She created Arquitina.org, which is an incredible organization that is driven to increase the fewer than 1% Latinas architects like licensed across the country. As a profession, women identifying, Latina identifying architects make up fewer than 1% of licensed architects in America. And so this organization was about how do we increase that through, they run a cohort with getting Latina women who are interested in licensure and getting them through licensure, connecting them with professional mentors. And then it was like, let's create these stories to raise the 1%, one Latina at a time. And so it was this anthology of, I don't know, I can't remember how many of us there are, 20, 30 stories of different people's story on how they became architects. And talk about like, there are common threads through the story, but then there are also just really diverse and beautiful ways in which people have come to this profession and the way that they're even using the profession, because there isn't even consistency in that. We're not all practicing architects. Some people are doing other things, but still licensed architects at the end of the day.
What was the surprising story you've heard? I know for me, like I'm born and raised in DC.
Mm-hmm.
So I've always been surrounded by Black professionals,
Mm-hmm.
Black architects. And what surprised me was there are students, there are Black professionals who have never encountered Black architect before, other than
Mm-hmm.
like, I don't know, themselves or, when they go on the internets and do the research. Was there a story in this anthology that was just like, wow, or even like conversation wise that you were like amazed?
Yeah, like I said, there are these themes of stories of similarly people who never were exposed to architecture, who didn't have examples of what that looked like. There are also stories on the other side of like an uncle, typically not another woman. So typically a male in the family that was an architect. I think the power in it is the commonality of the immigrant experience, the drive, the hunger, the sort of relentless pursuit of a dream. I think that to me, more than any one particular story, is the piece that carries through, because that is consistent. There's an architect who's practicing in Mexico. For her, it's the same thing. Like she's not pursuing the American dream, she's pursuing the Mexican dream, but it's still the dream of being a Latina architect, because like we are here not through anything that's super easy. We are here and it's been hard. And so really celebrating that and recognizing two things: the collective power of positive think, the si se puede sort of mindset. And then the other is the collective power of community. Our culture, our community, our families lift us up. I always talk about how I was raised by a village as much as I was raised by my parents. And in a lot of these stories, that comes across as well, is that like we do this to honor our parents. We do this to honor like my dad's sisters and mother who came here in the pursuit of a better life for themselves and their children and their grandchildren. Like to be able to say we did right by them. I am able to do something that that was the purpose of the sacrifices that they made. That is the commonality in the stories of Latinas in architecture, I think.
What amazes me too is I know plenty of individuals who come into this country, and in their country they're already architects. Mm-hmm. So when they come here, they have to start all over.
It's so stupid.
It's heartbreaking. I'm a licensed architect in my country. Right. Building in El Salvador, it's the same building as it is in California. A stud is a stud, right? Maybe some fire codes or something, like building codes or whatever, but it's ridiculous.
It's such a disservice to the community, the architecture community, and to the built community. Imagine Because the thing that really stinks is, yes, there are some folks who choose to continue to stay in architecture and fight that fight and restart all their licensure, all of that crap. But there are some that leave the profession because it's too hard. And what a detriment to society and to our profession to not capture that lived experience, because it just makes the architecture so much better to have multiple people from different perspectives all working together towards something, right? I'm not here to say that like every building should be designed by a Black or brown architect, but I think having us at the table and then having that inform who else is at the table and the questions we're asking, the way that we're reflecting on what we hear, and then how that translates into the built architecture, there's no comparison.
The exams also, English is a second language to many people, and the exam is designed to trick you. It's not a straight, it's not a straight, it's not a straight question. And the way you say, the way it's written could be interpreted in so many ways. For an individual who, again, English is a second language, you're reading this and you're like, what are you talking about?
And just even, I mean, the type of vocabulary that's used, and I don't even mean technical vocabulary, I just mean kind of the like just the way the questions are phrased.
Yeah, exactly.
It's not accessible. Mm-mm. It really isn't. And I mean, we're talking about folks, English is a second language, that are, new to the country. There are parts of, I think about the Mission District in San Francisco, where people have lived there their entire lives and they still, like, English is still a second language because their community doesn't have that level of language, of literacy. And so how do you expect someone without significant support to be able to easily sail through architecture school and the exams? It is not surprising to me why we find ourselves where we find ourselves. Moving forward in the work that we do with NOMA, this call to action. And for me, the call to action is pretty basic. Question the design brief you're given. Who is defining the problem? And then go out and do some intentional inquiry to better define the problem through the lens of those most impacted by inequity. And then you better be damn sure that then you hold yourself and your partners, your clients, all of that accountable to that feedback that you got. To me, that's how we impact change, right? And we do that within our firms, we do that outside of our firms, we do that in community, but that need to be intentional about centering racial equity and social justice in the built environment is long past due and will serve us in so many ways, not just in the built environment, because the conversations that I have with students or even young adults that have gone through school and are coming to the realization that critical things in their life, I always tell this story. We were doing some work and there was he's probably in his early 20s, a young Black man who we were doing an exercise that we learned from Dr. Amada Perez called reading space. And we were walking people through kind of what are the cultural messages that everyday space sends us. And, we were looking at schools. So one of the spaces that we showed was a school. It was a traditional classroom that we've seen 9 million times, all the desks facing in one direction, towards the front. There was a whiteboard, or blackboard in this case. And the teacher's desk was kind of raised on a pedestal. And he said, holy smokes, isn't what he said, but I've always looked to white women for the answers. And I never realized why until I looked at that picture. Wow. In every case, there was a white teacher at the front of the room and the chairs were set up. Everything was set up that she was the person that I needed to get the answers from, not from my friends of color, not from my Black buddies, not from my brown buddies, but her. And I am 25 years old and I'm just now realizing that that's still what I do.
Wow.
Right?
Oh my
like freaking A. Like, how do you hear that and not forever think about the work that you do as an architect differently? You don't, right? And so that is what, as hard, I always say that the work that I've been doing over the last 3 years has been the hardest work I've ever done, centering this work, but it's the right hard. And it's conversations like that get you up in the morning to then do it again the next day.
This is why you're an architecture. This is
the reason I was born to do this work.
You're practicing.
For sure.
Thank you so much.
Thank you, Melissa. Thanks for having me.
Thank you.
Hey
listeners, I have an exciting announcement. I decided to launch a membership program for the show, where you have a chance to support me and the show directly. I love creating the show, and it means the world to me that you all tune in to keep hearing me week after week. But it takes an immense amount of time and energy to produce. I want to keep the show going, and I want to invest in its growth. And I also want you to become a partner with me in this journey. That's why I'm excited to give you a chance to officially become a supporter of the show at glow.fm/archispolly, ARCHISPOLLY, or by clicking the link in the show notes. It's quick and easy. It takes less than 30 seconds and just takes clicking a link in the show notes and using Apple or Google Pay. You don't have to create any new logins, and you can contribute as much or as little as you like. If this show is part of your day or week and you like what I'm doing, then visit glow.fm/archispolly, all one word, and support me and the show in any way you can today.